Hello, my name is Peter Pilgrim, and you're listening to another edition of the Java Web Users Group Birds of a Feather presentation. Meetup number 17 took place at Oracle's City of London offices in Moorgate.
Very happy to be here. This is actually a milestone for me because it's the first time that I'm presenting this to anyone, basically. And especially, well, pleased to have a couple of Struts committers and the father of Struts himself, which is really good. Just to be very interested, certainly, to hear what you guys have to say about the work that I've been doing. The agenda today is just going to go through a bit of background, introduction, how this came about, go into the details, so talk about some of the different aspects of the features, enhancements, and so on that I've put in, and also just to finish off with some concluding comments. Hi. So, just a little bit of background about Struts. Who hasn't used Struts before? It's probably a wow. Okay, I'll take that as a. We're all familiar with Struts. It's certainly the most successful Java web framework, first widely adopted MVC Model 2 framework, if I'm correct in saying that. And it's certainly proven on thousands of projects. Groundbreaking in its time, but I think these days, I think it's probably fair to say that it's not universally popular, and I'm saying this on the basis of just what people say when you ask them about what they think about working with Struts. And some people would say that it's been overtaken by other frameworks. And I think even within the Struts team, there's, I guess, through the planned WebWork merger, there's a kind of a tacit admission of that. I guess there will be people out there who obviously disagree, but certainly that there is a sentiment along those lines. There are various Struts initiatives, which I'm certainly not going to go into any to talk about any detail today. Shale, and I take it most of you guys are probably at Java 06, so you would have seen Craig talk about Shale. And then the Struts Action 2 framework, which is the proposed WebWork integration. And then, of course, some continuing developments along the Struts line itself, the existing Struts line. So just talking about some background into how I got involved in this particular project. Last year I had some in-depth experience working with component-based frameworks, so in particular Tapestry and JSF. I got to know them pretty well, and also did fair amounts of work using techniques like dependency injection, which we all basically probably using in some form now. And Java 5, I've been pretty much using Java 5 exclusively since about, say, March last year. So in about August, I had a requirement to build a new application in Struts. Struts was a kind of preferred in-house framework. And I was initially reluctant because I really kind of got into the Tapestry JSF way of doing things. And I certainly didn't really want to forego all these nice features which are present in those frameworks. So, but I think it's, in a lot of these cases, changing a framework that's been being used for several years in an organization is obviously quite hard. And it takes a lot of kind of organizational impetus that you need to kind of move. There gets a certain amount of momentum behind frameworks, people get trained and so on. So in the end, I had to go to Struts, and I decided what I wanted to do was to try and add some additional features onto it, which would make it, for me, better and more productive. Given that I had Java 5 that I could use, I didn't need to worry about having to keep it Java 4 compliance and so on. So I did the project. That project basically finished in a couple of months ago, in fact. And since then, I've done some internal refactoring. I probably implemented about half the features that I've got now at that point. I didn't like the way I'd done quite a lot of things, so from my point of view, I've at least tried to fix most of those things, and I've added quite a lot of new features. And I think that there is, well, I'm not going to say that there is a demand for this particular set of features, but it certainly solved the problem for me, and so perhaps it might solve a problem for other people. And for that reason, I'm planning to open source it. And the provisional name that I've come up with at the moment is Struts Plus, basically just Struts plus a few extra features. So it's built on the existing built on the existing Struts 1.2 code base. The main features, in a nutshell, and I'll talk about all of them in a bit more detail as we go along.
You got my last one.
Are pure Pojo action beans, and when I talk about pure Pojo, I mean we're talking about the actions which are the main parts of the application being written in Java classes which don't depend on any framework-specific interfaces. Action dependency injection, so that's where you have the dependencies of your action class being resolved declaratively rather than through code, through programmatic means. Action controllers. Action controllers are they work together with action beans, and I'm not going to explain the mechanism right now, but I will explain it a bit later on. Interceptors, so before and after execution of the methods in your action bean, you can have pre and post interceptors being executed, and these can be added via configuration. Data conversion and data conversion and data binding. I think I missed out. And validation, form validation, data conversion, data binding via annotations, and a pluggable navigation mechanism. So those are the main features. Just a couple of quick points on the design goals. I wanted to offer or even improve on some of the features offered by competitive frameworks. But at the same time, I wanted to simplify but not to replace the Struts existing programming model. So there are no high-level architectural changes. We still have actions, action forms. They're all still present, but they've been enhanced. And the user interface layer, if you like, the interaction between your controller and your view, if you like, hasn't been changed. That's identical, and the configuration as well. Another design goal: don't air your dirty linen in public, which basically means that the application users don't want to see the internals of your framework. And I certainly didn't want to see it. I don't think anybody else actually wants to see how it works. You just want to have clean interfaces to work with, and that's it. Didn't want to introduce any compatibility issues apart from Java 5. I wanted to be able to go to the manager of this project that I was working on and say to them, this is still Struts. Well, of course, he didn't really sort of, at the end of me showing it to him, he said, well, this isn't really Struts. But for me, I wanted to at least be able to make that case. And keep it easy to learn for existing Struts users. So all the concepts that are being used here are pretty much familiar with what is in existing Struts applications, but they've just been expanded. So talking a bit about the details. Let me just quickly show you the application. Once again, it's not going to break any design records in terms of, but I'll just so I can give you a flavour of which a bit of background for some of the examples that I'm going to be using. Very simple CRUD operation. It's a holiday bookings application. You can add, well, a leave request. Is it going to start? Yes, it is. Okay. So there you can say you're going to go to wherever you're going to go, to Venice or whatever, start date, number of days. That's it. very, very simple domain. And so I've just got the single kind of master view, edit, just delete this. Bit of validation in there. And then same thing, I can add so on. So this is just the application that I'm going to be using, which will give you, so you've seen it, so I can refer back to it when I talk about it through some of the examples. Right. Every application, every non-trivial application is going to have, certainly every application, most applications at least, is going to have forms. It's going to need validation for those forms. And obviously how you do that is an important part of the application. Talking about form validation and the form elements first, mostly because they're probably a little bit easier to talk through. Some of the other stuff is maybe just needs a bit of warming up first before I can just run it by you. Manual validation of code can be fairly verbose and basically fairly tedious. There is an alternative in the existing Struts, which the validator framework. I don't think that it would be certainly from my point of view. I wasn't 100% comfortable with the idea of using the declarative XML-based validation from the validator framework because of the format's fairly large validation file and can lead to what some people will call XML hell. But just looking at an example, here we go. I mean, we've all seen this kind of code before. Programmatic validation. And there I'm basically just validating the date field, checking validating the number of days in my application, and checking that it's not null, and also checking that it's a correct time. In the extensions I've been working on, we still use action form. The interface between the view layer and the action forms is unchanged. The validation and binding actually occurs within the action form itself, and the way to enable it, if you're using one of these applications, you simply implement a marker interface in your action form called annotated form. You add your validate annotations to the setter methods, and your validate method that you define in your action form will also be called as well. So you can have some manual validation if, for example, you want to validate multiple fields or do something which you can't actually handle very easily with the annotations. And the same example that we saw just a moment ago can basically be condensed to this. Checking for required, checking to see that the type is correct, and so on. So it's a fairly sort of condensed, version of what we had before. You can have as many validates on a particular setter as you like, and they'll all basically be taken care of. Another nice thing is it's very easy to add them. So if you want to create a new...
Sorry, was that the message key that was in that annotation?
Right. Yeah, yes, that's right. Yeah, message key. That's right. So you might be wondering, how easy is it to add validators? What would I actually have to do to add a validator? And the answer is pretty basic, really. You won't need to change any XML, and you won't need to change any existing file. There's a fairly sort of simple mechanism which is based on what I'm calling the annotation factory pattern. And I'll just show you some code just quickly. Basically, that's my annotation definition. Okay, validate required. And what it has here is it has another, basically it's a factory annotation, if you like, and it refers to a factory class which is going to be used to take the contents of that annotation and turn them into a validator. So if we look at the implementation, there it does. It takes the annotations and it will read the annotation and produce, in this case, a validator wrapper which contains a validator. And the validator itself has a very simple interface where you can see validate is basically the method that you need to implement. It's also generically typed, so you can, using the same mechanism, you can have strongly typed validators. So for example, you could use the same mechanism to validate, let's say, arrays, file infos from your file uploads, and so on. So if you're going to want to create a new, add a new validator, all you need to do is you create a new implementation of this validator interface. You create a factory class which is going to be able to take an annotation that you create and turn that into an instance of that implementation, and then you define with your annotation, you define the name of that factory class. So the consequence of this is that you don't need any additional configuration other than what you've actually added into the annotation itself. So no XML registries or any existing file changes to add this in there. And this particular pattern I've used in quite a few places in the application. So I'll tell you where I've used it, but it's proved to be certainly very useful.
So does that mean these are server-side only validations?
Yes. At this point, definitely. I mean, I'll tell you might ask it, but yes, that's the answer at the moment.
One idea to think about might be to analyze the annotations at runtime and figure out what the right JavaScript should be for them too.
I mean, that certainly would, I would think that certainly would be possible. I haven't got around to doing that yet. Another thing which I'm also investigating is whether you can basically take the, let's say, a mixture of using annotation-based validation and also validation where you're using the validator framework, and whether you can actually use them together in conjunction within the same form. And that's something that I've thought about looking at, but I haven't actually looked into. Data binding and conversion. This is something which, if you're writing a Struts application, can involve a fair amount of code. And one of the problems with action forms is it's difficult to use richly typed properties in forms. And in practice, I think most Struts applications will generally use strings for most forms, even when it is representing, for example, a date type or an integer. Another problem is, even if you are using richly typed form properties, you don't have, if I'm correct in saying, you don't have per field control over type conversion. Effectively, you're going to be using the type conversion mechanism which is built into the way that you've registered your bean utils, your bean utils classes. And once again, as with validation, manually data binding your code can be fairly sort of verbose. So just a simple example from Struts. I'm basically I've just got part of my data conversion code, and that's just getting a date, taking it from the form, which is a string property, and I have this class called holiday booking, and one of the fields there is the date. That's the date of when I'm going to take my holiday, and I need to turn that string into a date, and I need to do it both ways. I need to do it from the form to the domain and backwards, and these two methods show the code that would be taken to do that. In the Struts extensions, the binding and conversion layer also takes place within the action form itself. So once again, the interface between the view and the action form hasn't changed, but we've added something to the form itself. The way that you do it is, once again, you have a form which implements the annotated form mark interface. You add bind and convert type annotations to your getter methods, and you also add a getter and setter for your domain model into your form, and the controller which will basically handle the calling of the binding code, so that happens in the right place. And you'll probably understand what I mean by what I've just said now, after I've shown you what the controller looks like. But basically, you don't need to write any code to have the binding take place. It just happens. The only thing that you actually do need to do at this point in time is you need to make sure that the form has a domain model object which is going to be bound before the binding takes place, and before whichever way you're going to do it. So that's basically what the equivalent code looks like. I've got my domain. Oops, wasn't meant to happen. That's my domain object here, and I'm converting the string to a date, and then I'm simply binding to booking, that's a property name, and start date, that's a property within the holiday booking object. Once again, you can add your own bind handlers. I've basically got two out the box. One which is that simple one that we saw there. Another one which will do some binding based on a lookup, which you can get, for example, if you have a drop-down menu. It can do a lookup of an object which is in the drop-down menu and bind that to one of the items in your collection or list or whatever it is, to a property of your domain model. But you could add more using the same mechanism which I was talking about earlier, where you define you have a handler interface, you create an implementation of that interface, you create a factory class, and you add an extra annotation in the annotation itself that you create of the name of that factory class. So once again, using the same pattern without any XML changes. You can do the same thing also with type converters. Most of the time, for example, if you're using integers and longs and so on, you can just use the default type converter, which is basically just based on bean utils. If you want to do something a bit more advanced, you can add there's a property of your annotation where you can say the name of your converter class. If you actually want to parameterize the converter class, you can actually create your own annotation for the converter, and then you parameterize that annotation. So just coming back to an example we saw just a moment ago. There, I've done that. I've got the convert date, and that's basically the converter that gets used during the process of binding.
Oh, okay, right. So come back to it.
Okay, so that's it for forms. How am I doing for time?
You're right. Another half an hour.
Okay, good. All right, I'll try not to get stuck on anything. Still quite a bit to cover. Dependency resolution. This is a fairly sort of big topic these days, especially with Spring and all that kind of stuff is very much kind of at the forefront, if you like, of a lot of developments. And talking about how dependencies will get resolved in existing Struts 1.2 applications. Your state will generally be held in request session context attributes. It's a fairly sort of verbose API to use to be constantly extracting strings from requests and attributes from requests and from the session and so on and so forth. And you also need to do quite a bit of typecasting as well. So, and you can certainly argue that it's not terribly object-oriented to be constantly using the servlet API in that way. Another issue is, for example, request parameters. If you want to have typed request parameters, so for example, often you have an ID which needs to get passed to the action. That ID will need to be type converted before you can use it. Service layer references often obtained by would be obtained by programmatic hooks. So, for example, Spring has an action support class which makes it easier to get your Spring action application context, and that's an example of a programmatic hook. It's something where you would actually need to kind of get into the inheritance hierarchy to make that happen in an easier way. So just seeing the example of all of this work, we've got get at web application context is exactly what I was talking about there. We basically we are type converting this, assuming of course that the request parameter is not going to return get parameter is not going to return null, and we're using the request set attributes and so on. Within the Struts plus application, actions, or at least a portion of the action, and you'll see what I mean by that in a little while, are instantiated on a per request basis, and your dependencies are resolved declaratively via annotation. So the annotations will have type request parameters using the converter interface that I was talking about earlier on. Request session application context attributes, Spring beans, message resources, locales, pretty much everything that you can actually access when you're writing a Struts application. You can create an injection handler for. So just to see what it would look like in the example. This is pretty much the same application that I was showing a moment ago, and where I was basically getting an ID and executing some server-side logic and returning a result. And the dependencies there are basically the Spring bean and the request parameter, and these are both being injected. The request parameter is, in this case, is a long, okay, and the Spring bean you can see is a bean named holiday booking service. So, although you could argue that lines of codes wise it hasn't actually shortened, it's certainly become a lot simpler, and the actual working code is all defined within the execute method has become a lot simpler as a result of this. I don't need to go into much detail on this one. But once again, the mechanism for adding dependency injection implementations is very easy, because simply have a handler which you need to implement, and there's a simple interface here. Get the value from the action context. The action context, in this case, wraps the request request server context, action form, pretty much everything that you would have access to in a request from within a Struts action. And so you can use that and use this interface to extract any value, and that's essentially the mechanism you need to implement. And once again, you create a factory, create an annotation, register the factory with the annotation, and it's that simple. And as I was mentioning, injection is possible for any data that you can obtain via the request, the response, application context, action mapping, and action form. So, actions and controllers. So we've seen the dependency injection. That's basically going into the action. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the way that I've taken actions, handling actions. One of the things that we all know about actions in Struts 1.2 is that your actions need to be thread safe. So you can't, for example, have request-specific instance fields, and also makes request level dependency injection impossible. So, for example, you couldn't take a request parameter, inject it into your action in that way, because that wouldn't be thread safe. Another issue, at least for some people, is there's a single inheritance hierarchy, And the overall effect is it is more difficult to reuse request processing logic because first of all you can't use the instance fields for your request state, and secondly because you are to a certain extent already tied to an existing hierarchy of object hierarchy. Although I'm not sure if that is in itself such a big problem. So what I've done is basically taken the action and more or less divided the responsibility of the action in two. Because if you think about a typical action, it's doing two things. It's embodying some request workflow, and it's also doing some domain-specific stuff. So let's say, for example, in a form submission, your request workflow might include things like, should I cancel or should I execute? Or it might, well, certainly in our example, when should I bind my data from the form to the domain, and which way shall I bind it, and stuff like that. Okay, so in any action implementation is a certain amount. Sometimes it can be very simple, sometimes it can be complex, but there's a certain amount of generic, if you like, processing logic that goes into it, and that's pretty much what the controller does. The rest of it, which is domain specific, is handled by the action bean. Action beans are pure POJOs, basically. They don't extend from any framework class, and in fact they don't implement even any framework interface. They're registered in Struts config.xml exactly as if they were plain old actions. So as far as the configuration file is concerned, they treat it identically. They will identify the controller, so the action is responsible for identifying which controller it's going to work with, and the controller and it does that via an annotation. The controller defines an interface which the action must implement, and the action has to implement that interface. So there's a kind of a synergy, if you like. There's a requirement that they need to work together. And as we've seen before, dependencies for this action being are resolved via dependency injection. So any request processing pattern can be abstracted into the controller, and the action being its responsibility is to handle the fine-grained domain-specific interactions. So just looking at the outline, so here we see the controller, and the controller that's going to be handling this is called basic submit controller, and the interface that it needs to implement, which is defined by the controller, which we'll see in a bit, is basic submit action. This is handling form submission, and we can see the two interfaces: there's a cancel and an execute. So we've taken the problem of figuring out whether we have to cancel, whether we have to execute, out of the action, if you like, that the application developer needs to implement, and given that to a controller. And you can pretty much take any logic out of the action, any generic logic out of your application action, and give it to the controller in that way. And then the example, cancel, execute, it will basically do whatever it needs to do. So set its messages, execute its logic, and call the service layer, and so on and so forth, based on whether it calls cancel or execute. So coming on to action controllers, the action controllers define the action beans interface. So they say, if you want to work with me, you need to implement this interface. Implement the request processing workflow. They instantiate an action bean per request. That's how I basically got it implemented by default. And that is so that we can get the dependency injection, so we can use the state. We can use the instance fields. We don't need to worry about thread safety. Interacts with the action bean through the interface. Single instance, So it holds no request state itself. So and actually the action controllers extend the Struts action class. A few out-the-box implementations handling form submission. Also, I have some implementations handling the lookup dispatch action, mapping dispatch action, and so on. Those action classes, that functionality has been also mimicked among the controllers that I'm using. But the key point of the controllers is that a single controller is reusable across many actions within an application, which will simplify the application. So just to give you an idea of what a controller implementation might look like, here's this basic submit controller, which defines the interface, so it can immediately cast the action bean, and then it does some logic to figure out whether the form is cancelled, and depending on whether the form is cancelled, it will call action.cancel, action.execute, and then it will call get action forward. It returns a view adapter, and I'll explain when I come on to navigation what that's all about. One really, I think, powerful feature is you can have custom action bean annotations, and essentially we have an action bean annotation reader interface which essentially allows you to write code which can read annotations in your action beans. What that allows you to do is effectively to extend the contract between the controller and the action without actually changing the interface, and that's very powerful. Once again, it's using a similar kind of pattern to the one that's been used before, so there's no XML source file changes. And already there's quite a few uses that I've got for it. Reading those dependency injections that we saw earlier on, that's implemented through this mechanism. Pluggable navigation, which I'll show you in a bit, is implemented through this mechanism. Action bean source configuration. I actually have an annotation called Spring Bean. I'll just show you the code actually. Sorry about that. It's in the samples. Yeah, okay, here we go. So this action here, I've added an annotation here which says this particular action is actually a Spring Bean. It's being managed by Spring. And that's the name where it's registered in the Spring configuration file and under Spring Action Bean. So there is actually, I won't show you, but there is actually an entry in the Spring configuration file of this name. And with this mechanism, you can use Spring AOP or whatever in your action itself. It basically is managed by Spring. But I guess the point is, it's the mechanism which it's using is through this custom annotation feature. One thing which you could also do quite simply is basically make actions singletons, action being singletons, if you only wanted to use the non-request specific dependency injection and maybe try and increase performance of it. You could do that. The dispatch method lookup that I was talking about, all those dispatch type actions have been implemented using this mechanism, and we could also quite simply do it with for interceptors, have action specific interceptors using this mechanism. So it's quite powerful. Talking about interceptors now, most web applications have some common operations: logging, authentication, custom state management, so on and so forth. In Struts 2, if you wanted to implement that kind of logic in your application, what you basically need to do, you can pretty much do it in two ways, if I understand correctly. You can extend your request processor and use some of the hooks there to add some custom functionality. Or you can create a kind of common action base class and then have that applied across your application. In both cases, you are effectively interfering with an inheritance hierarchy, which, if you're using interceptors, you won't need to do. You've got two interceptor interfaces. There's a before interceptor, after interceptor. The interceptors can be registered via configuration. The interceptors I'm talking about at the moment are global, so they will automatically be called if you register them for every action. But I was talking just briefly about how it would also be possible to create them for individual actions as well. The before interceptor is called after dependency injection happens, so it has full access to all the state that's been supplied via the dependency injection mechanism. You can interrupt execution of your action by throwing an exception from that. That's how I have it at the moment. The after interceptor will be called before view handling, and an exception will, in this case, will be logged. That's how I have it. It won't stop the view from displaying, and neither can return a navigation result. That's basically left to the action to do that. So just a very simple example. I'm just logging here. I'm logging an action before and after. I'm implementing both interfaces here in this action logging interceptor. Just a very simple example of how you could use an interceptor. But you could use it in lots of different ways, obviously. Record state, history, state management, so on. Okay, that's basically the flow diagram. I'm not going to explain the flow diagram. It's fairly straightforward, really, what happens with the interception.
So can the interceptors be chained, or is there only one interceptor?
You can have as many as you like, basically. You can have as many before and as many after as you like.
How do you configure the interceptors originally?
It's in the configuration. At the moment, it's a properties file. Thinking of probably creating a plugin as well. It should be fairly straightforward to do.
Yeah, that would be true.
Okay, so navigation. Navigation in Struts 1.2 happens by returning action forward. And you can create the action forward in your action class, or you can find it from the mapping file itself via the find forward method. Fairly sort of limited support within the framework itself for alternative styles of view rendering. So let's say, for example, you want to use, let's say, output some binary data. There are two ways of doing it. One would be within the action, and when you finish it, you return null. And the second way would be to forward onto the servers, which could handle that. So what I've basically done is I've got two sets of controller implementations with two different styles, if you like, styles of navigation. I've got basically the convenience solution, which is probably likely to be used in a lot of cases, or would be used in a lot of cases, and a flexible solution. The convenient solution is what Craig was talking about as the kind of outcome-based navigation. That's where you return a string, and the result of that string is then used, the find forward, mapping find forward, is used to then find the action forward to return. The second uses this navigate forward annotation, and there what you can do is, depending on what you return, in fact the way the navigate forward is implemented, you can either return an action forward itself, or you can return a string, or you can actually, there's another thing you can return, which is a page class. I'll tell you about this very, very briefly in a second. But I guess the main thing about the navigate forward annotation is it allows you to vary your annotations, your navigation style, without affecting the interface, the controller interface. So effectively, you can still have a single interface, change the navigation style without changing the interface that the action controller and the action bean are using to talk to each other. So here's an example of an action which uses this outcome-based style of navigation, and it's basically, in this case, it's built into the interface. So the results of string execute, this success, is automatically used to call find forward. So it's a convenient solution if that's how you like to work. If you want a bit more flexibility, or perhaps you prefer a different style of getting your action forward, then you can do it this way. And okay, I've actually renamed that to navigate forward. And in this case, it's doing exactly the same thing, except it's simply just using it's using the navigate forward to identify the method whose result is then used to determine what style of navigation will then be applied. I mentioned earlier that the controllers return view adapter and not action forward. There's a reason for that. There's two I guess styles. One is the action forward view adapter class. That's just an implementation of view adapter. View adapter itself doesn't have any methods. Action forward view adapter simply wraps the action forward. This is your way of saying, I'm happy with the default style of Struts navigation, I'll use that, thank you very much. There's another interface which is a sub-interface of view adapter, and that's called rendering view adapter. That has a render method, and if you create an implementation of that, you can tie that into your navigation annotation framework to determine how you're going to create an implementation of that. But the idea there will be that you take the responsibility of rendering away from the action, and you give it to an implementation of this interface, and that gives you quite a bit of extra flexibility. So one thing, for example, that we could do is you could have rendering via the Spring MVC style of views. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Spring MVC view interface. So you could quite easily sort of slot that in, create an annotation, and you could return, for example, return a model in view, and then you could basically, from that point onwards, you suddenly become Spring MVC. You could also easily support, for example, other styles of navigation. So, for example, AJAX, XLSLT, serialization, whatever. Basically, it's you could pretty much do anything using the framework. Not much of that has actually been done, I should hasten to add. Also, just a couple more things. Page classes. If you work with Tapestry or .NET, I think use this as well. You have the idea of behind a page, behind a JSP or behind a page of markup, you have a class, and it supports that concept as well. And that's particularly good, I think, for formatting logic, because what tends to happen with if you don't have that kind of thing available, if your formatting logic of your page becomes quite complex, then then it can be difficult to figure out where to actually put it, because at the moment you either have to put it in the page itself, which means lots of nested if-else tags, which is pretty horrible, or else you have to put it in your action, which effectively breaks the encapsulation of the layers of the application. So this is an alternative which gives you more flexibility when dealing with formatting logic. And put in a lot of some specific concepts also to deal with redirect after post to make it particularly easy within this framework, because I definitely think that's a smart way to handle post form submissions. So, in summary, the aim of these extensions has been to match the simplicity of Struts, certainly in terms of the programming model, to match the validation and type conversion power of the JSF tapestry model. Okay, admittedly, there are no user interface components as such. We're still very much within the sort of MVC style of operating. But you do get quite a few of the benefits of the component-based style of frameworks. And to match the flexibility of the kind of Spring MVC and web work when it comes to things like view handling. So, I mean, I guess it's obviously up to whoever, you guys and to whoever else sees this to, to say whether you think that I'm meeting those aims or not. But certainly I'd be interested to hear your opinions. So, the question is who should use Struts Plus? I would say it's a good solution for organizations which have invested in Struts already as a framework in terms of developer knowledge and also in terms of the existing applications that they have. They've moved to Java 5 and they also want a framework that enables them to support modern best practices of software development, so things like ease of testability, use of interfaces and design patterns, objects, OOP, and so on, and dependency injection, so all the kind of things that we like to have in our applications. Want these features pretty much now, don't want to have to wait like a year or whatever for them. But at this point, don't want the pain of a bigger migration, and I think that's the dilemma that a lot of organizations find themselves in, where they've been using Struts for a long time, and they're thinking, okay, well, it's time now to start thinking about what else do we want to start using, and a lot of what could be putting them off is thinking, well, it's a big investment, it's a really big investment to change frameworks in a lot of ways, and I would certainly argue that going for something like this is a much smaller investment in that sense, because you're not breaking backward compatibility, and conceptually it's quite similar to the existing Struts. So in terms of the current status, it's basically ready for an open source release. The only thing that's holding it back at the moment, I'm going to put in SourceForge. I'm waiting for an abandoned project takeover process to finish because somebody else was basically using a Unix name, which is a bit annoying. So that could take a couple of weeks. Nearly version 1.0 ready. I mean, it's kind of, when is it ever ready? Basically, it's one of those. But yeah, I think that's it probably needs one or two. It needs like maybe a good solid sample application, to sit behind it, and a few extra things to go into it. Any help would be appreciated, and any help in terms of any support, moral support, comments, whatever, basically, contributions, any help like that would be appreciated, because there's no way that I'm going to go alone on this. I mean, if it's going to happen, it's not going to happen purely because of me. It's going to happen because of other people's involvement as well. So I'm not the type. I haven't got the time. I haven't got the energy to make it happen alone. No chance. So, if it doesn't happen, that's the other thing. If it doesn't happen, so what? But I think for me, it's certainly been a very good learning experience to go through it and to try and sort of test out all these different ideas. And I think that there's definitely a place for it. It's really just a question of whether it happens or not. But I think that's really up to, well, it's probably not really up to me at the end of the day. But that's pretty much it. So, anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts? Do I have any time still?
Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes for questions.
Questions, thoughts?
I've got a quick one on the name.
Okay.
2 different points about it.
Okay.
One is you would be amazed at how many groups that use Struts in an internal organization have customized it, call their thing Struts Plus. So it's huge. There's more than one kind of. The other is that there are a few members of Apache that get a little sensitive about copyright and branding.
Okay.
And using an Apache copyrighted name
Okay.
is likely to read a couple of diagrams. That doesn't bother me. People
Okay.
would know the difference.
Okay. I don't really know how to take it. I mean, what I did do is I did send a note out to the developer mailing list, and I did suggest a couple of different alternative names. I didn't have any objection, raised to Struts Plus, and that's one of the reasons why I went with it for the time being. I came up with a couple of other ideas. For example, there's one which I had idea, which Strecks, basically standing for Struts extensions, which I guess wouldn't be offending anybody with the Apache.
Yeah, that would kind of bypass the.
But I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do about that. I mean, I'd suggest, I don't want to offend. I don't really want to offend the Struts community. So I'd suggest, if you guys feel strongly about it.
I don't think anybody in the Struts community is going to care. At least that would be my opinion. But it'd be Apache.
Okay.
The problem is you want to have something with a clear name so everyone understands how it relates
Yeah.
to what you're extending.
Yes. Yeah. Do you think it would be worth raising with anybody in Apache?
Yeah, the PR people would be the ones to go to.
Okay.
You guys just say, are you going to give me any grief if I use this kind of name?
Right.
Was it PRCs? That might be for the public relations.
There's a marketing blog somewhere. Posting it on there.
Is any particular individual that you might
Send me an email and I'll get you contact.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts about the framework itself?
I did have one question on the technology part of it. I have a great idea. One of the
And I was sort of questioning this one really, whether it was actually relevant or not. It'll basically say like one sort of synchronized method call, basically using the marker interface rather than using annotation. Like say you look up in a synchronized method call. So that's basically the only reason. Any other thoughts?